Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure we'll have people kind of slowly rolling in, but I want to go ahead and get us started since it's that time. So today we're joined by Dr. William Yu as we continue our discussions around reparations. Last week, of course, we talked with Professor Brooks, who gave us a lot to think about in our overview about reparations. In case you missed it, it is still on our YouTube channel, so you can watch that. It will live there for a very long time, so please feel free to check that out. Today, as a note, of course, like last week, at the end of the presentation portion, we will have time for Q&A. So feel free to be thinking throughout the presentation about what questions you might want to ask today. So now I want to introduce Dr. Yu. Like I mentioned last week, I do miss being in person for these. It's, there's definitely something missed when we're on Zoom, but just like last week, what I'm really grateful for in this time is that it makes welcoming Dr. Yu a lot easier than than if we were in person and needed to try to arrange, flights and bringing him from the Atlanta area. So I'm very grateful that you're able to be with us on Zoom today. So Dr. William Yu is Associate Professor of American, Religious, and Cultural History and Director of the Master of Divinity program at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. He is the author of American Missionaries, Korean Protestants, and The Changing Shape of World Christianity, and editor of the Presbyterian Experience in the United States, a source book. He is currently writing a book on race and racism in Presbyterianism across colonial North America and the United States. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. I have a few slides to accompany what is hopefully a brief presentation and mostly time to engage your good questions and insights. I'm delighted to be here. I am a native of New York. I was born in Huntington, about 70 minutes away on the Long Island Railroad in Suffolk County, and a product of, the Comac education system, the 11725. That's where I was born and raised, so it's a delight. I remember fondly and not so fondly the many train rides on the LIRR from Huntington to Penn Station when I was younger. And so now here I'm going to share my screen, and I want to give a brief presentation, thinking clearly as you all study reparations, slavery, U.S. history, and American Presbyterianism, how we remember it and how we apply it. I think these are the questions that not only First Presbyterian in New York City, but congregations, Presbyterian and ecumenical, are grappling with all over our country. And lies, my teacher told me, everything your American history textbook got wrong. Historian, sociologist, and author James Loewen, he finds several problems with how history is taught in high schools across the United States. He observes that many white Americans remain perpetually startled at slavery. Even many years after high school, he finds white adults are aghast when confronted with the horror and pervasiveness of slavery in the American past. To Loewen, it seems they did not learn or have too quickly forgotten that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were among the multitudes of white Americans who owned enslaved Black Americans as their human property. Loewen surmises the ignorance of white Americans on enslavement can be traced back, in his mind, to high school classrooms. He finds that history textbooks incorrectly present slavery as an uncaused tragedy, and that they minimize white complicity in the enslavement of Black Americans. He thinks that the overwhelming emotion or reflection or feeling that high school students are supposed to or meant to feel in studying this period of our history is sadness for the plight of 4 million enslaved Black persons in 1860 at the eve of the American Civil War, but not anger toward the approximately 390,000 white enslavers, because these enslavers and their unjust actions do not appear in the pages of the textbooks. Since Loewen published his book in 1995, I think there have been strides to improve the teaching and learning on slavery. One notable example is the introduction of lesson plans based on the 1619 Project from the New York Times in middle and high school classrooms across the country. For example, in Buffalo, Baltimore, Chicago, Newark, the nation's capital, and other towns and cities. Yet the backlash against a more comprehensive curriculum on enslavement, which is perhaps most visible in President Trump's recent call for a 1776 commission to directly challenge the pedagogy of the 1619 Project, reveals the need for an assessment. In my mind, as a theological educator and as a historian of American Christianity, I think about how theological schools and congregations are also engaging these educational debates around slavery, the history, and the legacy of it. As I reflect on my experiences, first as a theological student, now as a theological educator and ordained Presbyterian minister, I'm concerned that seminary classrooms and Sunday school classrooms and congregations, perhaps all over our country, are failing to provide instruction that properly captures the totality of white Christian involvement in slavery and anti-Black racism. The perpetual shock in some white congregations over some basic historical facts about slavery, in my mind, is alarming. One harmful myth that I encounter is the notion that most white Christians in the antebellum period were abolitionists pushing for the immediate emancipation of enslaved Black persons. This is simply not true. Very few white Christians held this position, and there was little support, not none, but little support for immediate emancipation in the antebellum period among the Baptist, Episcopalian, Methodist, and Presbyterian denominations. Many white Christians in the southern states defended slavery so vigorously that some Black and white abolitionists identified white churches as among the most impenetrable strongholds against their cause of abolition. Benjamin Morgan Palmer, a prominent white Presbyterian pastor in New Orleans, who previously, before taking this call, taught at my seminary, Columbia Theological Seminary, preached in November 1860 that slavery was a providential trust that whites must preserve and perpetuate, because he believed the natural condition of Black Americans was servitude. Palmer also mocked Northern abolitionists for thinking that Black Americans could survive alongside whites as equals if emancipated. Palmer was neither reviled nor rebuked for his white supremacist views. Rather, he was widely celebrated. And perhaps the most visible example of this is that he was elected to serve as the first moderator of the newly formed Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America, the PCCSA, in 1861. After the American Civil War ended, the PCCSA would become the Presbyterian Church in the United States, or the PCUS. And this PCUS would exist for over 100 years until the reunion of the UPCUSA, which was in some ways known as the Northern Presbyterian denomination, although that's not entirely true, because there were congregations that belonged to the United Presbyterian Church of the USA throughout the country, including in the American South. But this reunion of the PCUS and UPCUSA happened in 1983. So from 1861 to 1983, you had the Southern Presbyterian denomination, of whom Benjamin Morgan Palmer was its first elected moderator. Black Christians and white abolitionists, like you can see on your screen, Reverend Wright, Sojourner Truth, and Reverend Lovejoy, emphasized that the eradication of anti-Black racism was an essential component in or to their abolitionist activism. But even some white Christian abolitionists in the northern states fell woefully short in their advocacy against anti-Black racism. Archibald Alexander, who taught at Princeton Seminary, endorsed the colonization movement to send free Black Americans to Liberia because he felt the discriminatory contempt white Americans, including white Christians in his Presbyterian communities that he knew was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, Alexander wrote that anti-Black racism was morally wrong and that it was unreasonable and irrational, but he did not commit to working toward racial equality. Instead of teaching white Christians to repent of their racism and white supremacy, Alexander advocated or preferred or prescribed that Black Americans, once emancipated, should leave the country and find another home where their skin color would not be so despised and be a detriment to their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Seminary classrooms like the one I teach in today, we may not teach or treat slavery as an uncaused tragedy, but I do believe that some of our teaching and learning and theological education also minimizes white Christian complicity and misdirects the anger our students should feel about slavery. Rather than fully grappling with the histories and legacies of economic exploitation, sexual violence, and virulent anti-Black racism, sometimes perpetuated by white American Christians and white American Presbyterians, students are sometimes left with a neatly packaged lesson on slavery centered on the dangers of deficient biblical interpretation and the warning against proof texting the Holy Scriptures. Such instruction, while valid, misses, I think, a crucial point that the abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who you see his narrative on your screen, themselves made, which was to identify and confront the anti-Black racism of white Christians. First published in 1845 in his narrative, Frederick Douglass differentiated between genuine or true Christianity and, in his words, quote, the corrupt, slaveholding, woman whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land, end quote, in his autobiographical narrative. In our ongoing pursuit of repair and racial justice today, I do believe our seminary classrooms and perhaps congregational classrooms like the one we're here on Zoom in today must also engage in teaching a more complete history of slavery, white American Christian complicity, and what it might take for us to repair these foundational sins. I'll stop there and open it up, Nicole, and to all of us for Q&A. Let me also stop share my screen. Okay.
Great, thank you. So yeah, if you guys want to start thinking about some of your questions and putting those in the Q&A or in the chat box, we'll try to monitor those pretty closely. And in the meantime, I'll get us started. One question I have is if you could speak a little bit about some of the things that the PCUSA as a denomination has done on the issue of reparations and related institutions as well. Like, what are some of the things that they have done? Where are we falling short? Like, where are we as a denomination right now?
Oh yeah, thanks, Nicole. So I think it's a tricky question at one level because the PCUSA as a denomination has a founding date in 1983, but it also claims many antecedent, denominations such as the PCUS and the UPCUSA and the others. So I think I can answer it by, again, let me go back in history some before maybe getting to the present. I will say one challenge among Presbyterians as a predominantly white denomination in the antebellum period. Let me start there. Between 1789, when I think that was the first, then they were the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. Their General Assembly in 1789 through, let's say, until the period of the Civil War was the few times I see repair or reparation noted. I will say one is in the 1818 General Assembly minutes when they really, that was at one level, it was a pretty strong statement against enslavement, noting that it was incompatible with the Christian gospel. Just all of it, the idea of treating enslaved Black persons as human property, and the dehumanization and the horrors and the brutality of it. But at the same time, there was, in addition to that strong theology, there was no strong action. There was no strong discipline. It was rather a strong encouragement for both either emancipation or support of the American Colonization Society, which several white Presbyterians were fairly deeply involved in its early years. And the note of repair really was in thinking about what would it be like, again, because of the law, as messed up and crooked and immoral as it was then, to kind of repair, or how do you compensate enslavers for their human property, which was legally and lawfully theirs with the valuations of enslaved persons. So that was one thing. And so I think in some ways, some Presbyterians look to the example of England, who had broader emancipation and abolitionist policies, especially in the early 1830s. And I do believe there they saw there was an effort to compensate enslavers in the Caribbean. And so there were talks about that. I will say many abolitionists did not support compensation or reparation for enslavers, such as James McCune Smith, prominent Black intellectual, a colleague of Frederick Douglass's, wrote for Douglass's newspaper. He said he didn't support compensating enslavers because it would justify the legality of what was, in his mind, just an illegal and immoral system. But that was at one level. That was a real concern. I just want to be honest about what for white Presbyterians in the antebellum period. In addition to thinking about the immoral, unscriptural, unbiblical practices of enslavement, it was how do we engage and tackle what was really a foundational structural sin that the economy was built upon. So I think afterwards there, and I know there are a lot of other questions, I will say more of the, in my mind and in my study, more of the dialogue and the discernment around reparation for Presbyterians in our history has been around moral and spiritual repair, in the sense of like how do we make things right, or how do we provide a just witness? How do we bring people, particularly, let's say in this period, not that it's a binary of black and white, but certainly after the American Civil War, that was predominant. Like how do we repair relations? But I will say, for many years after the Civil War, Nicole and to others here, I don't see a lot of desire, whether it be in the northern states and the southern states, for the kind of repair that you and I are thinking about today. I think we need to be honest historically about what I shared before. The two-prong approach to abolition was very much emancipation and the eradication of anti-Black racism. But for many Black abolitionists like Douglass, James McCune Smith, Sojourner Truth, and others, they were really disenchanted and disappointed and critical of white abolitionists, including white Presbyterians, who were committed to the first, but not really the second. I think for Black abolitionists and few white abolitionist allies, genuine allies, they really saw that these were linked, that emancipation would not sustain and would not work without the eradication of anti-Black racism. But for white abolitionists, for a lot of reasons, I do genuinely believe, Nicole, part of it was the ferocity and the severity and the tenacity of anti-Black racism in white American and white Presbyterian communities all over the country, including the northern states. I'll say one example and we'll open it up. Samuel Cornish was a Black Presbyterian pastor, one of the first in New York City in the 1820s. And in the 1830s, I think it's 1834, he was wanting to go to a prominent white church in Manhattan on a Sunday morning. But at that time, that white Presbyterian church had segregated seating, which was common even in the northern states, where Black Americans sat in the balcony or in the back pews, and white parishioners, typically they did this thing called pew rentals, where you kind of included in your tithe and offering was a rental for your pew. And one very prominent white Presbyterian layperson and successful businessman, Lewis and Arthur Tappan were their names, the two brothers. one of the Tappan brothers saw Samuel Cornish, knew him. They were kind of colleagues in the fight for abolition. And he said, Samuel Cornish, why don't you come sit with me in my pew? And what happened was just a great controversy around that. Again, this is generally an abolitionist congregation or a congregation that supported it. But people were furious that Tappan would do this and that Cornish would sit in his pew, that it would break the boundaries and the cultures of racially segregated seating. So much so that it was in the newspapers. The pastor of the church had to come up with a statement. And what he said, I think, was fascinating is that at the time he thought Tappan and Cornish did nothing wrong. And that if we were going to really apply that principle to Tappan and Cornish, wasn't Jesus himself a man of color? Would Tappan be invited to allow Jesus to sit in his pew? Kind of pointing to the ridiculous, immoral of the segregated seating. But Tappan, he actually felt sorry. And even many years later, I think it was in 1870, as he was reminiscing about that moment in the 1830s, he, in some ways, I don't know that Tappan said he regretted it, but he said he felt like it distracted from the abolitionist cause, that it caused so much consternation and so much anger among white parishioners and white congregants that they needed as allies, that I think he said something like, he did it too soon, that it did not fit the fastidiousness of the age. And I think that goes to some of the challenges around repair that I would say Presbyterian denominations and communities had at least through the 19th century, really not being able to get at the heart of anti-Black racism in white communities, including white Presbyterian ones.
Yeah, you said so many things that I feel like we can ask a million questions about just that answer. But one question I have related to that, what you were just talking about, is I know the PCUSA has, there have been different overtures or whatever, like to General Assembly at different points in time, but there's a lot of criticism around how much that has actually been acted on or carried out. We saw things like the creation of self-development of people as sort of a response to some of that. But still so much, we saw it again at General Assembly this past year, or not this past year, this past June. And how I think what you're saying, even if there's been little pieces that are trying to be addressed in some ways, a lot of that work has just not happened even still now. And I guess we've also seen some of the seminaries looking at reparations from a financial standpoint. But do you have other thoughts about like some of those overtures to General Assembly and how some of that work has been carried out, some of the what the seminaries are doing? What still would you recommend we be doing as a denomination?
Oh, thank you, Nicole. I speak as one member of our denomination and not as a representative of it in any way. Well, in one way, we are a representative a church, certainly where every member has voice and has influence and has say. But I think one I will share, and I see other good questions in the Q&A. I think one challenge that I don't know, and I hope to learn more, Nicole, from you about what's happening at First Presbyterian in New York City. But I think it's been, in some ways, I'm going to be honest and say what I find has been too narrow an understanding of both, like the mission of the church and spirituality. So I will say, for the longest time, not only in the Southern Church, but particularly in Southern Presbyterian churches, but also throughout the country, there was in Presbyterian U.S. history this idea of the doctrine of the spirituality of the church, that the church really has a spiritual mission, and that spiritual mission is to preach and teach the Holy Scriptures and to administer the sacraments of baptism and communion. In some way, it's reflected in what the ordained pastor is called, right, in the Book of Order. It's called teaching elder, but it's also called minister of what? Word and sacrament. So much so that in terms of getting involved in larger social and political issues, that's not to say that the churches shouldn't be involved, but it should be in ways that are perhaps not as direct, because churches are spiritual organizations, not social or not political organizations. Certainly, there are people in all of our congregations who work in the world and who work in important fields like social work and medicine, law, politics, judges, all of that, school teachers. But like the mission of the church is not to teach and preach politics or political solutions, but it's to offer good biblical instruction that will inform people and how they can best do their work in their respective spheres. If you will, it's not necessarily this First Amendment idea of separation in church and state, but this idea that there are different spheres. And it was kind of what some Presbyterians saw as one lesson from the European Reformation, that it's not good for churches to get too politically involved because of the corruption that could happen through power and politics. But at another level, another strand in the same European Reformation, I think Calvin, I think John Knox in Scotland, that other Presbyterians such as Angelina Emily Grimke, she's just a wonderful example of grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. She was a Presbyterian for a minute. It wasn't very long. And in fact, some of it was her disenchantment with, and I think she converted to Quakerism, disenchantment with Presbyterian, just kind of what she saw as mealy-mouthed compromises on slavery. But she did say in Scotland, like Presbyterian reformers fought for social issues and fought for justice in the political realm. Like that too was a part of the Reformation, that it wasn't just a religious revolution, but it was a transformation to see society in the way that God envisioned it. So you have these two competing notions. And I think Presbyterians have been struggling with like how the church can operate. And in some ways, what I think happens is that it's this idea that our job is to change in the church, is to change people's hearts. And ultimately, with changed hearts, people will go in their separate spheres, whether it be courtrooms, or political legislatures, classrooms, hospitals, and they'll do their work there. So much so that I think it obscures that. One is, I think it's too narrow a definition of what it means to be spiritual. I think what it means to be spiritual also entails not just the soul, but the body and the mind, and like what happens here on earth. It's this idea of wanting to create and help construct a society that looks like the kingdom of heaven and that follows Jesus's prescriptions and teachings and biblical teaching and the like. And so it's this idea that what's spiritual and what's moral is also what's political and financial, that these notions are all tied together in one. So I do think that's something, I think at best, certainly, I think some support the more kind of incremental notion of a church being, again, a certain kind of spiritual organization that can, in the ways I kind of organically like lead people. But I think in another way, Nicole, and to the members of your congregation, I struggle with the doctrine of the spirituality of the church because I know that its foundational cause or motivation was to defend slavery, that it was a doctrine that really emerged in Southern Presbyterian churches in the antebellum period, to really keep churches and pastors and sessions silent on the issue of slavery, because that was a political matter. When we all know, and I'm not saying this with 2020 eyes looking back at 1840 eyes, they knew in 1840, someone like Douglas, that slavery was a political issue, but it was also a religious issue. It was a biblical issue. It was a Presbyterian issue, right? It was a Protestant issue. It was a moral issue. It was a human rights issue, such that the solution needed to encompass all of those avenues and streams. And to say that the church doesn't do politics really cuts off a lot of avenues to do God's work of justice. So I don't know if that's happening at your church and in other congregations kind of where you are, but I do think that's been one great barrier to reparation and racial justice. It's this idea that the church has a limited role, or the church has a great role, but it's limited to a certain definition of spirituality.
Great, thank you. We do have a few questions, of course, coming in. One of them is if you happen to know anything or have come across anything about this church or specifics around other churches for that matter, but good or bad about this congregation's history in relation to slavery and the abolition movement.
Oh, unfortunately, I don't know enough about your good church. I don't. I can share some. Certainly, I think Presbyterianism in New York City was a hotbed, if you will, of abolition, emancipation, the movement. I think so. So certainly, I think one strong legacy that I hope is not lost is certainly the long presence of historically Black Presbyterian congregations in and throughout the boroughs of kind of New York City and the like, in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Manhattan, and the Wells. So New York City really was a very influential spot for the emergence and growth of Black Presbyterianism in pastors like Samuel Eli Cornish, Theodore Wright. Another one is James Pennington. I might not get the first name right, but Pennington was the Black pastor's last name. So there was a lot of that, and there was a lot of movement for abolition. I think some of the divides I can share in New York City and the New York Presbytery around slavery and abolition was I think at one level the pace of the activist movement, and really weighing, as awful as this sounds to us, it sounds totally like not even like a compromise or a balance beam worth equilibrium worth holding together. But I do think it was emancipation of enslaved Black Americans and Presbyterian Church unity. There was a deep concern for how do we remain united as a denomination? How do we respect our siblings? I think they largely used the gender exclusive language of brothers, like not only our brothers in the South, but our brothers in the North who also either supported slavery or didn't believe that it was the church's role to actively participate in the abolitionist movement and the like. So there really were these things. Like if we go too far and too much in supporting our Black abolitionist colleagues, then we may lose not only support, but the fellowship of our white colleagues. And so that was something, and it was very challenging for, I can say for some Black Presbyterians and the few really kind of white allies that they had, I think they felt caught in between, right? Because they were, I can say Black Presbyterians, Pennington is one example I have. He was accused of being a rabble rouser from more conservative white Presbyterians in his presbytery for pushing too much and too hard on the immediate emancipation. But then he was also criticized from his Black abolitionist and some white abolitionist non-Presbyterian colleagues for belonging to a denomination that was so morally compromised and so mealy-mouthed about slavery. I think that was the great dilemma, one of the great dilemmas that we learned not only from the New York City example, but from Presbyterians at large. I do think in many ways, some abolitionists criticized Presbyterians for demonizing abolitionists, for being too radical and wanting to overthrow society, but treating enslavers, their Southern Presbyterian colleagues, as gentlemen. That they would use the language. How can these enslavers, how can you treat them when you're at General Assembly together? You treat them like your beloved brothers and as dignified gentlemen. Yet you treat the abolitionists who are criticizing and pushing your church to do more, you treat them as atheists, you treat them as radicals, you treat them as, men and women who want to mess everything up. I can share that. And I think New York City is a good example of, I think you see all of that in New York City. And I wonder if, I don't want to make like straight line analogies to the present, but I do think that remains an enduring challenge for American Presbyterians in a denomination like the PCUSA. Like, how, it's always like, how do we strive for justice in ways that bring people together, right? I think we hear that a lot. Maybe not a lot, but some. But I think one lesson from at least the antebellum period is sometimes, we have to decide. Sometimes doing what's right can't bring everyone together. And of course, the discernment of how and when to do that, that remains a fairly complicated application. But I think the prescription itself is pretty valid, right? When is it worth separating for the sake of justice and equality?
I love that. Thank you so much. Um, we have some other questions, so I want to
Oh,
get
I
to a
see.
few of
Which one would you
those.
like me to answer first? I see three, Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just, uh, well, that bottom one about pew rental is interesting. If you want to say any more about that quickly, I know I'm not an expert on the history of this congregation in relation to the pews, but I know we do have numbered pews, and there's been, some talk about what that was used for a long time ago. um,
Oh
can
yeah,
you speak?
I think one helpful thing that a church like yours could do, particularly post-pandemic, is to really look at the history of your architecture and to look and think and try to discern. Again, Nicole, how old is your church? Did it exist in the antebellum period?
So the congregation itself is a little over 300 years old. We celebrated our 300th anniversary in 2016. The building itself is not that old because there were
Yeah.
a couple of congregations that came together. So the building itself was from the mid 1800s. I don't
Oh,
remember the exact year
yeah.
off the top of my head.
Thanks. Well, I think in addition to pew rentals, I think in addition to architecture, uh, I imagine it would be a worthy enterprise to go through your history and your records to look at. I think there are several issues, even to think intersectionally, right? To look at how a church like yours engaged women's rights, women in ministry, how a church like yours engaged racial justice. Were there moments at a church like yours where there was segregated seating? When did, if there was, when did that stop? All of the like. And I think this gets to a question I see from someone about kind of strategies partnering with other diverse congregations within our denomination. I'll do that one first, and then the one above that from Elizabeth about the American Revolution. But I think yeah, there are a lot of wonderful ways to engage in partnerships. I think I think I'll say two things. One is I do think for many years, I think the Presbyterian strategy, if you will, to racial justice and moral repair has been multicultural congregations. And I think it was this idea, I see it in some of the General Assembly records, for example, in the late 1980s and throughout the 90s. This idea to diversify our denomination across race and ethnicity, and thinking about Latinx, Asian American, American Indian, and African American congregations, and even congregations themselves. Generally, in the studies of interracial or multi-ethnic congregations, I've seen the number as what constitutes a multi-ethnic congregation. It's 20% of a congregation being of a different race or ethnicity than the majority membership. So a church that's 80% Black, 20% non-Black would be, multi-ethnic and the like. So I think that's been, I see that as a big push. It's this idea that to make our worship more look like what heaven's going to look like when we're all there, or to more, this idea like that's a way to get at repair and racial justice, to really construct more hospitable, inclusive worship. And some of the conversation around that really even gets to like something like singing, like, right, what songs we sing. I think maybe that even happens at a church like yours, not only across culture and race and ethnicity, but also across like age and things like that. I see that a lot. Like do we sing 3 hymns from Glory to God, or do we include more contemporary music? All of that. Like, how do we make our worship space hospitable such that when different people come, it's, they feel comfortable and they feel like at home and in their hearts can worship God, all of that. So that's one. And I think another has been for I would say predominantly white Presbyterian congregation, others, this idea of trying to, 2 things. One is like diversify, if you will, who we hear from, like bringing in diverse speakers across. Again, I'm thinking intersectionally for churches that might be more male dominated, female speakers, churches that might be cisgender dominated, transgender speaker, churches that might be white dominant in the culture, to bring in speakers of color to help really kind of teach. And I think so. I see those as 2 strategies that have been employed. I would say, I think on the former, I don't know. One, I think there have been some successes, right, in diversifying, but again, some will note, and I think more recent demographics show the PCUSA is about a 90 to 92, anywhere from there, 91% white denomination. I think over 95% of the churches are mono-ethnic, not multi-ethnic and the like. And so I think some people despair at that. Like that's a sign of defeat or a lack of progress. And to Nicole and members of your church, perhaps it is. But at another level, I think, in addition to multicultural, I see a movement now that churches are also thinking, like, what does it mean to be anti-racist? Like, my church need not be multi-ethnic to be anti-racist. And to think that multiculturalism isn't the only solution to being a church that is deeply involved in racial justice and racial repair. So that's one. And the other, I would say, is I think speakers have been helpful. I think just the personal, I can't say this from like history, but I think in some ways what's more useful than or different from speakers is, I would say in my own life, growing up in Korean American churches, I grew up at the Long Island Korean United Methodist Church in Commack, New York, 11725 zip code. And there was a white congregation that my Korean congregation rented space from. So we just worshiped at different times. And there are a few times where we fellowshiped together. I will say not much, but that was my experience. And so for me, what really helped me, in addition to hearing from different speakers throughout my life as a Presbyterian congregant minister and the like, was really beginning in college when I started attending different churches of color in my life, spending weeks or months at a time. For example, I went to college in Philadelphia, and I worshiped at several different historically Black congregations in West Philadelphia, because it was a stone's throw from my college campus. And I learned so much more from being one of the few non-Black worshipers in Black congregations through a summer in Philadelphia than from like 3,000 Black preachers that would preach in my predominantly non-Black, either white or Korean American context. Like, you know what I mean? Like 8 Sundays at Black churches, being the only non-Black person or one of the few non-Black people, that helped me understand more about kind of what was happening than a multitude of Black speakers, that I would hear in a context where I was comfortable and I was part of the majority. So I wonder if that's like I see lots of churches now, they have, Presbyterian churches, they have signs like immigrants and refugees are welcome. Sometimes they have all are welcome in Spanish, signs outside their door or in the lettering, of their churches, changing the Black letters around. But I think in some ways, So some say, we have these signs that say all are welcome, but nobody's coming that are not like us. And so I think sometimes it's like, are there Hispanic and Latinx congregations like in your neighborhood? Perhaps what's more valuable than saying all are welcome in Spanish is for you and a few members of your church, not like everyone, but to go worship there. Like, yeah, like one obviously barrier is language, right? These worship services might be in Spanish or Korean for people of my parents' generation, and it would be uncomfortable and it would not be as meaningful to go to a worship service in English, right? So then what some people tell me, Nicole, is, but I don't understand Spanish or I don't understand Korean. But then I'm like, what are you asking them for when you want Korean and Spanish speaking persons to come to your worship service? Like, aren't you asking of the same thing when you look in horror when I say to you, go to the Korean church for a Sunday, go to the Spanish speaking church on a Sunday? But I think, again, yeah. So I think at one level, partnerships are good, but yeah. So I'll leave it there to that question.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. We have a few people who have chimed in to give the year that the current building was built. So thank you, folks. That the current church was built 1844 to 1846. So just putting that out there. So thank you for jumping in on that one. And then we do have a couple of other questions. I don't know if you can see those at the top of the Q&A box.
I do. Thank you. I never answered Elizabeth's question. And I hope it's okay. It's like, I'm calling y'all by your first name like we're good friends, and we're obviously not yet. But I hope that's okay to call on your church members by their first name. And I see Suzanne's question, and I see thank you to Scott and Sorrel. Apologies for any mispronunciations of your names. Yeah, let me try to tie these two around. So let me, with Elizabeth's question, or actually, Jeffrey, you two, you're there. Any thoughts on this? So certainly, so let me take it from a Presbyterian perspective on the American Revolution and thinking about the founding of our nation. In the records of, first there were presbyteries in the Northeast. I think Philadelphia, Long Island, Newcastle, Delaware, New York. These were the kind of early presbyteries and centers of Presbyterian life and ministry in the 18th century, starting in 1706. And then so you have Presbytery Synod of New York, and then you have General Assembly records from 1706 to about 1789. What I found surprising is enslavement is really not really there in the records. There's not a lot. There's a little bit. There's some African Americans. There's a notion wanting to support a few New England clergy persons, both Presbyterian and Congregationalists, part of the UCC today, to support free African Americans to be missionaries in Africa. So there's a little bit of mention there. There's not as much on slavery. And I think that reflects one of these other moral compromises that occurred in the 18th century. For example, Presbyterian clergy persons like John Witherspoon, who was from Scotland, became one of the first presidents of Princeton College, which was initially a Presbyterian school of higher education. He was fairly strong for American independence. Like the idea of separation of religion and politics really wasn't there. He said, like, we need political liberty to have religious liberty. And he noted that we are slaves to Britain, right, politically. And so others pointed out, like, what about enslaved Black persons, right? If you are talking about being free from slavery, from kind of British colonial rule, we have this other huge moral problem. But it was, even then, something that was recognized. And I think the idea was the hope that in future generations that slavery would be abolished. I think at one level, I'll say during the American Revolution and before 1790s. I think there was some idea, particularly in northern states, that from some, I don't want to overstate it, but that enslavement would kind of die out organically because it wasn't as profitable, particularly in states that didn't have the climate and the conditions for agricultural work. And like New York State. But of course, I think much of that changed with the invention of the cotton gin and the ways in which and technological advancements that made cotton production so much more efficient with human labor, which meant enslaved labor. I think Whitney, that was in 1793. So much so that it was this idea, the challenge during the American Revolution and afterwards, I hope I get the numbers right, to Nicole and Jeffrey, Elizabeth, and others. I think there were approximately 700,000 enslaved Black persons, I think, in 1790. And so even then, I think for Presbyterians and other white Americans, this idea that, like, what would emancipation look like? Like, some say it's like a failure of imagination. I'm going to be honest, I think that's a little too romanticized and ideal. I think it's a failure of morality to consider what, and I will say Alexander MacLeod, who was not part of the PC in the USA, but I think he was Reformed Presbyterian, different Scottish denomination tradition in Scotland. But he said in a sermon in New York City in 1802 that emancipation would have to be tied to not the language of reparation, but a sustainable, committed pathway for enslaved emancipated Black persons to survive and thrive. I think one notion he had was for older emancipated Black persons, there would need to be some kind of fund, like a widow's fund, to help support them who are too old to make money themselves. And he said for children, there would need to be, I'll use the language of kind of scholarships available for education. I think he just was saying to provide educational pathways for them. So where there was this idea that emancipation would come with some complexities around like what life would look like, you know, for a more equitable society. But I think, again, it was this idea that it's just there, it's a really big problem. And of course, Nicole, white abolitionists, Black abolitionists, you know, kept saying, like, the numbers are going up. Like, I think in the 1830s, it was around 2.5 million. I read one white pastor in Virginia saying, you know, it's at 2 million now, it's gonna be at 3 million and 4 million. This idea that enslavement is kind of too big to abolish, like that's like we have to do it before it gets more, not the other way around. But anyways, I think that was again something like, so what I find in the records from pastors, Presbyterian clergy in the North, who particularly supported the colonization movement, it was this idea that they acknowledged that the enslavement of Black Americans was morally reprehensible, but they also acknowledged the difficulties around what a racially integrated, emancipated society would look like. So hence, for some, they supported the colonization movement, believing that, like Archibald Alexander, white contempt and anti-Black racism, even among white Christian communities, was just too strong to overcome. I hope Jeffrey and Elizabeth that gets somewhat. To Suzanne, your question, I think you're right. I think yes, the idea enslavement occurred predominantly, let's say even by the 1810s in the American southern states, but that it really was an economic system that white Americans benefited from across the entire country. And you note kind of the mercantile industry and the like, and certainly, so I've seen accounts from one Presbyterian layperson, but more kind of persons, business persons and industry who were Christian, even into the 1850s and 60s in New York and Boston, who really continued to support slavery, even though they had moral qualms about it, because they recognized it was so profitable. Like the idea that it was labor and cotton production, enslaved labor, cotton production in the South, but that the manufacturing happened in the North, right? It happened in textiles, just in businesses across places like New York City and Boston and the like. such that the entire economic system was founded and grounded in enslaved labor. I do think that's something that is just a reality, that white America across the country benefited greatly from enslaved labor, and I think that has never been fully grappled with in any kind of robust, real, meaningful way, even now into 2020.
Have you come across any other congregations who have sort of looked at that history for their own individual congregations?
Can you say a little bit more? I know we're running short on time, Nicole, about what you mean.
Yeah, just so like Suzanne was kind of mentioning that she's started doing some research into this congregation's past and where our money came from historically. But have you come across any other congregations, whether that's in the denomination or elsewhere, that have looked into their own congregations' funds historically, or made sort of public apologies and yeah, I mean kind of done that sort of work for their own congregation?
Oh, I know of a few churches in New York, Protestant, Presbyterian, that have certainly are doing the work that you described. Obviously, I think many members in your church may know of kind of the legislature in Asheville, I think in North Carolina, committing, I think it was to Suzanne's point, committing because of the recognition of the financial exploitation and the like, committing resources and real money, real dollars to support the building up and thriving of Black communities in Asheville through supporting nonprofits, education, and the like. I think there are churches in New York, or a Presbyterian in New York, that certainly also haven't there been where there have been a kind of selling of church property and giving funds to kind of the indigenous community from whom the land was the original owners of the land. And I think there's another church in New York that's committed to, in a way Suzanne's described, committing funds and resources as an acknowledgement of financial realities to support ministries and both Christian and secular agencies that want to, lead to the thriving of particularly Black Americans in their neighborhood community, right? Is that what you mean, Nicole? I've seen some.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts that you wanted to share, or things you wanted to mention before we close?
Yeah, I see, Elizabeth, your question. I think what's challenging about this question, the revolution, was it fought expressly to protect slavery against abolition? I think it's a very live historical debate today. I think you will find historians that fall on both sides of that answer, such that for me, I'd like to kind of focus on the Presbyterian history side of it, such that I don't know that I can provide an adequate answer to that particular question. But I do think, in closing, I will say, and I appreciate this time with you, Nicole, and the invite, and to members of your church. No, I'm encouraged that you all are engaging the history, and not only the history, but what it means today. And I think I will say one. So sometimes I think in doing sessions like these with churches like yours, not to say that this is your church, Nicole, but I think what sometimes happens is, and this happens more, I think, when we didn't get to this time period today, the civil rights era of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. when I am trying to present as honestly and faithfully as possible Presbyterian involvement, I think what happens, Nicole, is some, I would say, are bracing for it to be pretty bad, whereas others are pretty surprised at how bad it is. And I think others, particularly in white Presbyterian communities, for example, around civil rights and the like, will say, they will point me to, or even in spirit of enslavement, they will point me to the people they know or the people they've learned about, the Presbyterians, the white Presbyterians they've learned about, who were out loud and proud abolitionists, who were strongly on the side of Dr. King and Rosa Parks and the civil rights movement, right? And they will say, what about those people and those heroes and heroines? And Nicole, I'll say, like, that's, yeah, I think they're worthy of study and we should follow their example. But I think in your education and mine, we've spent 90% of our time focused on the 10% of white allies who were in the Presbyterian Church who were doing what's right. So what I'm trying to do is I'd like us to spend more time on our ancestors of faith who got it wrong. Not to vilify, but to say that we need to learn from their example as well of why they didn't do what was right so that we can do what's better. And I think other times I hear the example of, but that's what the times were like, particularly around segregation. Like my church, or we weren't doing any differently than like what was happening in Jim Crow segregation everywhere, right? And I would say, like, I guess so, but like, do you want to be held to a higher standard? Do you want historians to look back and hold Presbyterians to a higher standard? I would hope so. If we are committed to being Matthew 5, salt and light, if we're committed to being ambassadors of what is good and what's just, I think, yeah, and I appreciated Suzanne's question. I think we want to get into kind of all of the history. I think so. Also, what I hear a lot, I'll close on this, is, the PCUSA today, or a seminary like mine, perhaps a congregation like yours, like, we exist today because of the faithful stewardship and financial giving of generations past, right? So we should thank them for that generosity and that stewardship and that faithfulness. And I don't disagree at all with that. But like Suzanne's question, I would say, but we also want to be honest about where that stewardship and where that giving came from, right? And we want to be honest about that and try to do what's right today. Not in a way that vilifies, but in a way that's really like honest. Aren't Christian called to be honest people of faith? And so I'll just end it there. Not the best ending, but just I hope that this time has been helpful to you and to your ministry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to end. And I think all of your presentation and your answer to the questions today gave us a lot to think about as we really begin this journey of thinking about, all of this and our own congregation's history and how we want to carry the work forward. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I know lots of people are chiming in to say thank you as well in the chat box. So thank you so much. For those from First Church, the last of this, at least first series on reparations, will be on Sunday, November 8th, where we will really have a roundtable discussion. So we'll have a formal presentation that day. That will be an opportunity for congregants to come together and start, talking about what we learned these past couple weeks, what we heard, and what we might want to do going forward. So join us for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Yu.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.